Just going to read to you a couple of verses that Iris read a moment ago. Verse 27, chapter 2, verse 27. And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. So there's a number of controversies in the church, in the big sense. I guess we could probably, if we wanted to, we could find some controversies here as well, where between what we might call Bible Christians, people who think God speaks through the Bible, that it's his authoritative word, and yet we can find some differences. And one of those would be the Sabbath, what we do with Sundays and such like. And the extreme ends would be, well, it no longer applies. Jesus fulfills the Sabbath, and so we don't need to do anything about it in particular. The others is a lot of strict do nots. And so it's basically rules versus freedom. So where is the balance? Well, you'll be pleased to know that this morning I'm going to give you the right answer. You wouldn't expect me to give you the wrong one, would you? But it's not always, but often, Christians' disputes are because they've got the wrong question. So sometimes it is right that we focus on detail, and there's perhaps a balance, or John Stott used to say the balance is in both extremes. There are times like that. Sometimes someone is just wrong. But what we often do is we focus on the detail, which is right, because it's there for a reason, that's okay. But we detach that from the heart of the issue. And that's the problem, not just with the Sabbath, but all kinds of things that Christians disagree about. And the heart of the issue is verse 27 and 28. He said to them, Jesus said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. And so there's many times where Christians, as Christians, we lock into something with some do's and don'ts, or how X or Y should be done. And there's various opinions about how we do these things, but practically anything we do as a church or in church, anything we do as private individuals outside of church, but we often miss the point behind the practice. We sort of tunnel vision onto a practice, and we've forgotten why the practice is there. And so we detach it from its purpose, why it was given. More so, we detach it from Jesus. And so like many other things, missing the point, we miss the point about Sabbath teaching. We miss how it is about Jesus. And so these verses help us rethink that issue. But also, what it's really about is how we're drawn to Jesus, how Jesus brings the best out of these teachings. And like the rest of what we've been looking at Mark, but actually it's true of all of the Bible, it's less about information, less about learning about this or that's involved, more about meeting with Jesus. So a good way to start is by defining our terms. Christians, and others for that matter, often disagree because we're using the same words, but we're using different dictionaries. And so very quickly, I'm going to very oversimplistically give you a Bible overview of the Sabbath, because it's a recurring theme and a developing one. So this is the background to what Jesus is saying. So the Bible starts at the beginning, literally, with the creation week, and it ends with the seventh day, God resting. Now, elsewhere in the Bible, we're told that God doesn't rest. He doesn't need to. But what it means here is he rests from his work in creating. He stopped creating. And so he's at rest, as you are when you finish a job. But it means more than that. The word rest is loaded in the Bible. It means peace. It means things as they should be with God and with each other, and so on. Now, when we come to, so that's what we have the creation week. Then we have life in the Sabbath, life in the rest. In chapter 2, then chapter 3 is the fall. They lose their rest. But the day is marked in creation, and it's built into the created pattern. And then it's one of the Ten Commandments. But it's given two reasons. So the Ten Commandments is mentioned in Exodus and Deuteronomy, but different. The wording for the Sabbath law is different. So in Exodus, it's because that's how God made things. There's a pattern. You're made this way. Deuteronomy says that's why God saved you, to return you to what was lost. So you don't work on the Sabbath, that's the Sabbath law, not to observe it and to not work, do your normal work, because you don't work. You were made to live in this rest. And because you don't work to enter it, you don't work into salvation. You're saved by grace, not by works. And also it mentions, doesn't it, there's a very practical bit of wisdom that 6 days you shall work. And the reason why you work on the 6 days is so that you can keep the seventh clear. And then in Exodus 23, we're told it's a sign. The technical word is a sacrament. Like we have the Lord's Supper, like we have baptism, something that is a visible word. So it's like it keeps telling Israel, it's like an acted out sermon. It keeps telling Israel, you were made and saved by God and for God to be in rest with him. And this is by grace and not by works. It's not about you. So you don't have a proper rest, but you have a taster of what was and what will be. I'm going to speed up in a bit. Come to the book of Joshua, and elsewhere, from time to time, we're told that the land had peace, or God's people had rest. That means there were no wars and other problems. Everything was as it should be, but of course it was always temporary. It didn't last like that. Really speeding up, book of Hebrews, we're told that that's because these rests were temporary, because there's a rest to come. What was lost at the fall is going to be restored, in fact better, in the new creation. So when someone dies, for example, there's a phrase in our terminology, in our languages, they're at rest. Now what we mean is, well, they looked pretty haggard before they died, and now they're having a good lie down. It means more than that. It means that they're with the Lord. They're back with how everything should be, or nearly as it should be, as they look for the resurrection of their body. And then in the New Testament letters and the book of Revelation, we see practically Christians used to meet on the seventh day to meet with the Jewish ones did, to meet with their other Jews and talked about Jesus. But the Christians, the first churches, met on the first day of the week, and they tend to call it the Lord's Day rather than the seventh day. Why is that? That's another sermon. We'll worry about that another time, but there's just a principle there. And then, as we had heard early on in the service, in Matthew's Gospel, Jesus says, "Come to me, and I will give you rest." Not if you're a bit stressed, I can help you chill. It means something much bigger than that, about how we enter his rest and keep it. We do by coming to Jesus. So the Sabbath and rest is all about Jesus and about knowing him and experiencing him. And there's lots more we could say, and over time we will, I guess. But that's the overview. That's the background to what Jesus is saying in Mark and what's being said to Jesus in Mark as well. So I can start the sermon now. So the issue then, and is what is the point behind your practice? Why are you doing what you're doing? And so there's two similar events we just heard about. Both happen on presumably two different Sabbaths. And Jesus gives us the principle behind the practice of rest and Sabbath, and therefore how we might get things wrong. So the first is it's about our good, and the second is it's about showing mercy. So the first thing is it's about... That was the wrong week. Don't worry about that then. I had a really good Bible overview, so you could have seen it really nicely. The rest I can live without, but never mind. So I've kind of given the point away already. The point of the Sabbath is, and the point of the law, is our good in Jesus. This point in Mark, where Jesus comes more and more into conflict with the religious leaders. And the occasion of conflict here comes in verse 23. On the Sabbath, he was going through the cornfields, and as they made their way, his disciples began to pluck ears of corn. So that sets the scene, and that's what's happening. And then that provokes a response in verse 24. And the Pharisees were saying to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" So the issue is, why are they working? Yeah, there's a law, don't work on the Sabbath. And so the question is, are they breaking the law? In the Old Testament, Sabbath breaking is so serious that potentially it is punishable by death, because it's seen as that important, because of the underlying principles behind it. So what the Pharisees then did is they say, well, you don't want to do that, do you? That this law really matters, so we must keep it. In fact, to make sure we don't break this law, if we don't do this, we definitely won't break it. If there's a fence around the law, then we can't do it. So if you were a farmer, as many were at this point, you were not allowed to reap on the Sabbath because that's your job. You don't do your job on the Sabbath. But the disciples are just wandering through picking bits of corn. Is that reaping, really? So the Pharisees were saying, well, if you don't pick, you're definitely not going to reap. There's no way you'll accidentally reap if you don't even pick. So they're being over the top. But the law allows for a certain amount of this. So there's provisions in the law to protect the poor and so on, that you were allowed to wander through. And as you go through, if I was walking to your house and I walk through a field, I can take some of the corn. But you're not allowed to reap your neighbour's field, are you? You can't go through with a big, I'm just picking, start reaping down their income. The problem here is when you introduce more than what the Bible says. And actually, I think we can do that quite easily. There's all sorts of ways we do that. There's all sorts of things we do that you may do as an individual, as a family, all kinds of things we might do as a church, which have good reasons behind them. But if they're not actually laid down in the Bible explicitly, we can't insist on them, can we? If God doesn't insist on something, then we can't insist on something. So that's the issue. The Pharisees have got their own misunderstanding, plus what we've seen with them before, this sort of attitude of fault finding, and it equates to the disciples doing the equivalent of us opening a bag of crisps and going, "You're reaping." You know, if you saw someone opening a bag of crisps and saying, "That's like building a car on the Lord's Day." That's what they're doing, sort of. It might not be as obvious. So Jesus could do what I would do, which he doesn't. Jesus could give a very simple answer legitimately and go, it's not really reaping, is it? It's doing what we're allowed to do in the law. He could say that, but he doesn't. He says, verse 25, have you never read what David did when he was in need and was hungry, he and those who were with him? He's saying, have you never read? Like you've never read your Bible. And he's speaking to Bible experts. So feel the offense of that, of what he's saying to them. Now, actually, people say that to ministers all the time. I say with experience. In fact, I even heard once someone say to Stefan when he was here, if you read the Psalms, he's PhDs in the Psalms, so he kind of read them a bit. He literally wrote the book on them. So Jesus is saying, if you've read, what he means is, well, you have read. I know you've read, but you've kind of, the words have gone through your eyes, but you've not read. You've missed the point. You've not understood. And then verse 25 and 26, good word, he shows really how they should preach. He reminds them of 1 Samuel 21 and then applies it to their situation. There, what happens there is David is fleeing for his life. Saul is trying to kill him. And he with his friends, as his little band, he's on the run. And he gets to the tabernacle, which is not in Jerusalem at the time. He gets there and he's given the showbread, the bread of presence, for him and his hungry friends, and he eats it. Now, we're not told explicitly this is on the Sabbath, but it probably is because on the Sabbath day they changed the bread round. And Jesus makes a couple of points about him and about the Sabbath and keeping the law. So first about him, it's all about him. He is David's greatest son. That's the point he's making. And David's son is under threat. So he mentions Abiathar, the high priest. And the interesting thing is Abiathar wasn't the high priest at that point. His dad was, Ahimelech. And when I was reading books about this, I go, clearly Mark got it wrong. And you're like, obviously. I think Mark knows the Old Testament better than I do, and most scholars, all scholars. So I don't think that's what's happening there. I think to cut a long story short, I think the point is that Abiathar is associated with David and that period of David's life on the run and becomes part of his group fleeing. And so Jesus is saying here, the king, just like David, just like me, David's son, the king of Israel is fleeing and being attacked by Israel's leaders. So a point about himself. And then a point about the law is the point of the law matters as much as the practice. Why is it there matters as much as the thing itself. So should people use the bread of presence for making their sandwiches? So could the average Israelite, because they did their shopping wrong, say, I've got a block of cheese, I could do with some bread, go into the temple or the tabernacle and take the bread of presence? No, of course you can't. It's completely forbidden. Only the priests can eat it. There's a special symbolic significance of this bread. But could it be used to relieve hunger? Yes. Now think about it. What is this bread? They used to have 12 loaves of bread at the front of the tabernacle or the temple. It symbolizes one loaf of bread for each tribe of Israel and shows that God gives them what they need. He provides them with their daily bread. He is a God who provides for his people. And so if in certain circumstances, like fleeing for your life, you're the king of Israel, if David could not eat the bread that symbolizes that God provides for him, that would be weird, wouldn't it? To say, look, God provides for us. I'm starving, can't touch that. Would be an odd thing at that point. It would ring hollow. So notice as well that Jesus' disciples in Mark, that they're not starving. In fact, you can go for a day without eating. In fact, this comes straight after the passage about fasting. And again, there we had to look behind what is the point of this thing. So they could wait till the next day. But what could be more resty, more Sabbathy, with the attention behind what those things mean? You know, is it keeping a rule that keeps people hungry, or does it allow food? It's about getting things the right way round. And so in verse 27, Jesus says, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. It's for your good. So for them to miss the Sabbath entirely, for us, the equivalent with the Lord's Day, missing out on something that benefits us, we're going to miss out. I mean, in previous churches, I've not ever heard this here. I'll put that out as a disclaimer. But I have heard in other churches, people who help with Sunday school during the service say, I'm not coming back for the evening service. I've done my bit. Now, it is a service to do what they're doing. It's a service for the people who are doing the music here and people who've done the stewarding and hospitality. It is a service for sure. You're encouraging others and helping others. But there is a point of coming to church that you're doing good to yourself. Certainly if you feel you've missed out on something, to come back in the evening. It's sort of missing the point, isn't it? But it's also possible to keep the day and miss the point when it becomes an end in itself. When either you're saying something like, look how faithful I am by how I observe this day, or when it becomes a drudgery. Often that's two sides of the same coin, isn't it? Now, how can that happen? What happens when we miss that the whole point of this is about Jesus. Verse 28, so the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Jesus, the Sabbath is about Jesus. He is the Lord of the Sabbath. Now that's really telling, really loaded. Because in the Old Testament, frequently when the Sabbath is mentioned, it's called a Sabbath to the Lord. And the Lord in capital. So God's name, the I am, Yahweh. This is a Sabbath to the Lord God. And Jesus says the Son of Man is the Lord, the God of the Sabbath. The Sabbath is his. And we keep seeing this in Mark, don't we? It's about authority. It was authority even over the Sabbath. Jesus shows authority over this and that and the other. That's God's authority that he claims as his own. And so that's that repeated theme in Mark. All authority, God's authority, becomes Jesus as God, as man. So sure, we could say, isn't every day the Sabbath? Because the Sabbath is fulfilled by Jesus. Every day is the Lord's. Yes, it is. It's like worship, isn't it? We could rightly say all of life is worship. It is. But there's specific times where other activities are put down and you focus on this one thing. By the way, you could also say marriage is fulfilled in Jesus, but we still have marriages. So it's a similar thing. But we must focus that it is about Jesus, not about denying ourselves as such. In fact, someone said to me, this is very helpful, well, I thought it was, it's not a day God takes from you. It's a day that God gives you. It's about what God gives you, not what he removes from you. Palmer Robertson, who some of you have met, said you can't break the Sabbath. You can't break it. It will break you eventually if you keep ignoring it. So it is a day to break from the norm and focus on the future, where it will be restored, where things will be as they should be with God and his people. It's about being replenished physically, not doing what you normally do, taking a nap, fellowship, a spiritual regroup and focus. It's about blessing, not about subtraction. And so the Pharisees missed the point because they missed that it's about Jesus. So don't miss the Sabbath rest, the Lord's Day, and so on. It's not about the restriction. It's about doing good to you in Jesus Christ. Also, it's about showing mercy. So that's chapter 3, verses 1 to 6. The whole law is about mercy. So Micah 6:8. We do Micah in the evenings. We'll get to this eventually. Micah says that we should do justly, to love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. If you're keeping God's commandments and it has the opposite effect of that, then maybe you're misreading his commandments or the effect that you're having. Something is wrong if that's what's going on. Sometimes following God's law leads to discomfort, and it's not convenient, that's for sure. And so we have here another Sabbath, another occasion. There's a man with a withered hand in verse 1 and verse 2. People are looking for an excuse to get Jesus. And he calls him and answers him and gives a very obvious question, or a question with an obvious answer. Verse 4, he said to them, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or do harm, to save life or kill? But they were silent. So what is lawful on the Sabbath? What do you think? What is lawful, to harm or to heal or to kill even? Sounds obviously enough, isn't it? It's not really a trick question, but they don't answer. They don't answer because the answer is so obvious that what they want to do, they would give an answer to. They'd be without excuse for what they do next. They are finding reasons to get him. And in the last chapter, we see a growing hostility. So it started in chapter 2, verse 7. They said, why did this man speak like this? He's blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone? Now, is that negative? Might be, but it's sort of true. And then gradually it hots up, so from what might be a neutral question to this. And as we go through, we find more and more opposition to Jesus. And so at the end of verse 3, it says they're looking of a way to accuse him. End of verse 6, they go to destroy him, to kill him. So again, we have Jesus that does a healing. He heals this man and shows what the Sabbath is about. It's about mercy, that Micah verse. Again, they're missing the point. We lost our Sabbath rest in God's first creation. In mercy, he's offered us one in the new creation. And so we have this reminder, these tasters en route, that it's not quite there. This isn't what it's going to be like. But just a reminder, the Sabbath is about rest. It's about mercy. If you can't show mercy on the Lord's Day, then something has gone wrong because Jesus restores. Think about what that might look like. So previous church, I had an assistant minister, and now think about this. What do you make of this? You're going through a service, and the assistant minister is preaching, and he hasn't turned up for the first hymn, the confession, the second hymn, and the prayers, and the Bible reading, and still no Chris. And then he walks in through the door and into the pulpit and does a sermon. That's going to be an awkward conversation with the minister, isn't it? And other church leaders. The reason why is he actually parked just opposite the church. As he stepped out, a man walking the other way grabbed his chest and fell on the floor. Now, if Chris said, I've got a sermon to do, stepped over him on the way, I'd say that's not very Sabbathy of him. Jesus tells a story about that. So he had a good reason. An obvious example, perhaps. But think about what we experience each week at church. Maybe there is someone, hypothetically, you find harder to get on with than someone else at church. Or they have a problem. Or perhaps they're a difficult person. And you go, this is my day of rest. Difficult person. What could be more resty more new creation Sabbathy than to be there for someone. Because God says, I require mercy, not sacrifice. That's more important than... It's great if you sing loud. I like it when you sing loud. But that's more important than that, isn't it? Again, something wrong. There's something wrong when we can be highly articulate about what can and can't be done on the Lord's Day, what should and shouldn't be included in a worship service, but people aren't treated right. How it's been said in the last few years in Reformed books and blogs about everyone has got the Trinity or worship or the Lord's Day wrong, to find out the person who is saying that and putting out an enormous amount of material is being abusive to people in his church in some way or another. Spectacular point missing. And so today of all days is a time to give and receive mercy. Yes, all days you do, yes, but especially today when we're reminded of it. It's not a day for nitpicking, but mercy, and that's the point. Again, this man is sick. He could have waited another day. He can't use his hand. He doesn't need to use it that day. He can wait to the following day. But Jesus showed compassion. Jesus is the source of all mercy and compassion. Notice this, though. What's happening here is who is evaluating the situation? Whose verdict matters? So notice verse 2. They are looking for an opportunity to oppose Jesus. Verse 5, he looks around at them. Who's looking at who? Who cares what they think? Well, short term, everybody. And it ends up with Jesus going to the cross. Jesus' view, though, just one person's view, that matters in eternity. So Jesus looks around in anger and grieved because of their hard hearts. He's using Exodus language. Actually, Mark does this quite a lot. Sort of Exodus type imagery. So looking around and grieving at their hearts, their hard hearts, is like God with Pharaoh. So Jesus is like God with Pharaoh. He's showing divine anger and compassion. He looks round at their hard hearts. So another warning to us for those who rightly think that we should do things by the book. If it's by this book, anyway, that's the right concern. But you can be enemies of God if your compassion is lost. And compassion on who, by the way? Well, here we have a sick man, earlier on the hungry disciples, in the last chapter on sinners, difficult, awkward people. As the Old Testament says of God, so mark of Jesus is he looks around and he has compassion on whom he has compassion. And he's grieved with just anger at those who resist what he's doing. And a little detail, but it's worth noting, as it's there, verse 6, the Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. Do you notice what happens there is how Jesus brings unity between people. Jesus brings unity between people who are very different from each other. He brings about unity in opposition to him. The Pharisees, you know about, they're religious, but they miss the point. They create rules around rules and over rules to make sure we don't actually do, but they miss the point. The Herodians, they're ethnically Jews, but they support Herod, who's an imposter on the throne of David. He's a collaborator with the Romans. And for decades, these two groups hate each other. These fuddy-duddy religious people and these compromised people who are messing up our country for their own personal gain, they hate each other. But Jesus unites them in their hatred for him, a greater hatred for him. They now work together against Jesus. And we see that today, don't we? So there are those promoting all sorts of things, new moral codes and things that are anti-church that way, with perhaps, say, other religious groups like Muslims another way. They've got nothing in common. In any other part of the world, they'd hate each other. But they're united in their opposition to Jesus and his people. There's a well-known intellectual couple who've both come to faith, or in the process of coming to faith. And people are protesting against them. And the husband, I heard say, I wonder what would happen if my protesters met yours. Because the reason why there's a group of people protesting against the wife is a slightly different group protesting against the husband about what they've said about Jesus. But it emphasizes the point. It's not about, the point is they just want to get rid of Jesus. They're not even working out what's right and wrong. They just want to get rid of Jesus. And people, by and large, will avoid logic and coincide and join arms with people just to get rid of that. So the Sabbath is about Jesus, and Jesus is about mercy. But both can bring the worst out of others. The Lord's Day gathering, look at what Christ is like. He shows mercy. So, back to the start of the question, how do we keep the Lord's Day today? How do we take the Sabbath principles and apply them to a normal Sunday? We thought about two extremes. One might say, Jesus is clear, anti-external, don't just follow a hollow if it's a hollow inside, so ignore the day altogether. But that's not what we're told here. That would be a jump. People often sort of dismiss legalism for good reason. But if we're talking about God's law, that the problem might be a hollow external problem. But notice this law is actually for our good. Like worship and other sacrifices you make for God, you find that you are the one that gains. It's for your good and for the good of others. And it's God's way. So to miss, you lose. It's not a day that God takes, but a day that God gives. The other way to do this is see how the Pharisees do this in the reading. Keep it, but externally, perhaps grudgingly. In the end, it isn't being kept either, is it? Some of you may know this, that for a couple of hundred years in England, there was a fine for not attending church. It was very rarely imposed, but there was a principle there. Now in Scotland, where they were Presbyterian, and therefore did it to a bigger extent, they actually would assign every week, 2 elders to walk around the town or the village, around the parish, to catch anyone missing church. Think about that. 2 elders broke the Sabbath to make sure no one was breaking the Sabbath. 2 people missing church to make sure no one missed church. It's completely missing the point, isn't it? Keeping the Lord's Day is not about externals, and it's not externals only. If you're not seeing Christ, the Lord of the Sabbath, therefore it's good. If it's not about showing mercy and grace, you're not keeping the day. So have a think for yourself. How do you approach Sunday each week? How do you prepare for it? Just perhaps even the idea of preparing for it might seem strange, practically, spiritually, to make sure that you do it. What do you think about when you come to church, and more generally about Sunday? Do you think, what a pain, what an endurance and burden, how restrictive? Do you think, well, I've done my bit. God and the rest of the church will be delighted. Actually, we are delighted when we see, that's for sure. It helps to know what we should be and what should be happening. Often we look at things superficially. We look at activities and then we rate them rather than think, what has God put there and why? Remember the point, above the action or the inaction. It's a deliberate stop, a deliberate pause to remember it's Christ's grace, not our works. And so that we can, so how can we rate what goes on other than, am I being obedient and joyful? It's a day, it's one of the reasons why we have a morning and an evening service, a helpful bracket around the day, when we pause, but we don't do our normal things and focus through acts of mercy and help others focus on the Sabbath that's to come. And the rest, where we will enter, where everything will be as it should be. And especially to focus on the Lord of the Sabbath, the one who makes it rest. He wants to do us good and to show us mercy. And he loves to meet us with his people, especially as we gather in his name on his day. Come to me, and I will give you rest. Now come to him every day, but on his day, to kickstart the week, with the week come. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath.